Walking westward through prairies and forests, mixed with fields of crops, you journey toward a city fabled for its immensity and grandeur. The morning sun warms your skin and creates elongated shadows. The trail gets bigger and continues to slice through more fields of crops, along with a few small villages. The smell of burning wood graces your senses. The ambient din of conversation, crackling cooking fires, women grinding corn, and children at play surround you. As you walk further down this path, past these inhabitants, you come across another village. But in this one, the houses have been placed around a red-colored large wooden pole planted into the ground. Upon closer examination of the village, the layout of the structures appear to have been planned. You pick up your pace, and by midday you see bluffs by the Mississippi River on its eastern edge. Walking past several more hills, you reach the edge of a bluff, as the beams of light from the setting sun compel you to shield your eyes. Looking to the west, you see a vast floodplain that disappears into the horizon. Squinting into the distance, you see through a thin haze an enormous building sitting atop a platform-type structure. Looking further into the haze, you make out a vast orderly city around the mound structure. In awe of what you see, you also observe that the hills to your right and left are covered with small mounds and wooden structures containing rotting corpses. Vultures circle the structures. You then hike through these mortuary structures while making your way down to the floodplain below. The sun disappears over the horizon, and you take shelter for the night in a thatched hut on the floodplain where the bluff begins to rise. You awake the next morning and walk across the floodplain, making your way past several farms growing an assortment of corn, squash, and sunflowers. Eventually, the magnificent city is but a half-mile away, its towering mounds dominating the view up ahead. As the afternoon sun beats down upon your head, you now find yourself surrounded by these mounds, along with plazas, enormous wooden posts, houses, and scores of people. A bustling cacophony of activity and voices grace your ears, while the rhythmic beat of a distant animal-skin drum sounds accompanied by singing. After another 30 minutes of walking, you find yourself in the downtown area of the city. You come upon the biggest plaza you have seen yet. People are moving about and singing upon the flat expanse. Looking across the plaza, you see one of the largest earthen works you have ever seen. Looking up at its summit, you see several people wearing intricate outfits. One of these elaborately dressed individuals walks to the edge of the mound and raises his arms. The 1,000-strong crowd of people gathered upon the large plaza below let out a great shouting cry in response. The crowd then divides in two and begins chasing after a small rolling disc racing across the plaza. Several spears are thrown at the strange object as the crowd continues to pursue it. You rejoice, for you now have finally reached the grand sacred city that you have heard so much about, a city known to us all today as Cahokia. At around 500 BC, the people of the eastern half of North America lived in small villages made up of bent pole wigwams inhabited by around 100 people or less. Squash, sunflower, knotweed, lamb's quarter, and maygrass were all grown. These people also hunted and gathered wild plants and animals. At around 200 BC, Mississippian farmers began to farm small amounts of maize and tobacco, which were two plants that had made their way north into the region from Mexico. Between about 100 BC and 400 AD, a trend of building geometrically shaped earthenworks using complex astronomy and engineering began and spread. This trend is referred to as the Hopewell tradition by archaeologists. Scientists think that these earthenworks were designed by prominent members of the Hopewell societies, such as leaders, priests, and shamans. Many of these mounds contain buried individuals whom were surely of high status at the time of their death, as evidenced by the treasures that they were buried alongside. By 400 AD, the Hopewell culture had all but disappeared. By around 800 AD, people living near the modern city of St. Louis, Missouri, began growing maize on a mass scale. At around this time, this location was a thriving village of about 1,000 people. At this point, between 750 AD and 1000 AD, the site gradually became larger and more complex, with high-status individuals holding sway over surrounding smaller settlements. By about 950 AD, the site had developed into a simple chiefdom. Towards the end of the 10th century AD, many settlements in the area of what would become Cahokia had structures surrounding flat open spaces. Oftentimes these flat areas would have wooden posts planted into the ground, large pits, or a big building. These villages eventually grew into much larger settlements by the late 10th century AD in the area of the central and lower Mississippi River Valley. These settlements also were much more permanently occupied compared to most other villages of the time, which were much more temporary. Between approximately 800 and 1100 AD, maize began to be farmed by peoples across much of the eastern North America. Each area varied in terms of how productive it was to grow and harvest maize. Those who controlled fields whom produced high yields were in a natural position to expand their influence. Commoners whom would otherwise starve during times of food shortages would look towards these land possessors for food, and thus the populations of those lands and their prestige would increase. Beginning at approximately 950 AD, the Earth's climate experienced a warming phase referred to as the medieval warm period by scientists. This brought up the average temperature in the northern hemisphere by 2 or more degrees Fahrenheit. The warmer climate, which led to an increase in rainfall all over the world, helped maize-growing societies in the Mississippi River Valley region flourish. Scientists think that this global event helped make Mississippian civilization possible, as the greater amounts of rainfall made it easier to grow maize. On the morning of July 4th, 1054 AD, in Song Dynasty-era China, a Chinese astrologer documented a bright new object in the sky, next to a crescent moon, that was classified by him as a guest star. This guest star was a supernova from the constellation Taurus. Only around 50 supernovas have ever been witnessed and documented by human beings. This particular supernova is only 1 out of 3 that have been documented to have occurred in the Milky Way. The supernova in the sky shined 4 times brighter than the planet Venus. For 23 days and nights, the supernova shined brilliantly in the sky and was visible throughout the entire world. It even remained visible in the sky to the naked eye for the next 2 years during nighttime. According to many archaeoastronomers, the supernova almost certainly had an effect on cultures around the world, as they sought to interpret its meaning using either the rudimentary sciences that existed at the time or by explaining its appearance within the context of religious belief. There are many artifacts from North America that have been found that may depict this supernova event. In the year 1054 AD, the site of what would become the largest city in prehistoric North America was just a small town of around 1,000 inhabitants. However, soon after the supernova, this settlement was burnt to the ground on purpose, and for the next several weeks and months, the remaining structures of the settlement were dismantled. At this point, the construction of what would become Cahokia began rapidly upon the ruins of the old settlement. The city's actual name is not known. The ruins of the city were later named after the Cahokia tribe, whom were living in the region when the first French explorers arrived in the 17th century. Using their advanced knowledge of engineering, geometry, and astronomy, the Cahokians, with their bellies stuffed with corn, proceeded to level the land and construct large monuments. This event would have enormous influence upon the Mississippi region for the next several centuries. Using only digging sticks, baskets, and stone-bladed axes and hoes, the Cahokians rapidly made flat a 50-acre central plaza and encircled it with Monks Mound, which would eventually become the largest structure made of soil in the New World, and dozens of other earthen structures. In the next several decades, workers would carry more than 55 million cubic feet of earth, using little more than baskets to create their monuments. Wooden poles around the size of modern telephone poles were planted into the soil throughout the area. The area of Cahokia lays atop a vast sediment-filled valley with lots of good soil for farming with a hoe blade. However, the nearest stone sources to produce the tools needed to reshape the landscape were all far away. As a result, Cahokians forged trade ties with people who lived near sources of stone, such as the peoples living near the Mill Creek and Cowlin Chert Quarry, which were only a short trip by canoe down the Mississippi River. Mill Creek chert was used for the creation of hoes, which was a highly coveted tool for farmers in and around Cahokia and other Mississippian centers. Cahokia had firm control over the creation and trade of these tools. This monopoly on the availability of the tool helped the city to flourish. Cahokia most likely had a strong influence and control upon a vast amount of farmers, as the sheer amount of people who lived in the urban area would have required a continuous flow of food to feed it. Cahokia had become in short order the preeminent power in eastern North America, with cultural influence and potentially military control over the region. The Cahokians also created a new spiritual belief system that would, within a few years of its formation, be introduced to lands far and wide. Many Cahokians directly introduced their entire way of life to the peoples of the Midwest and the South by traveling, establishing permanent colonies, and through trade. In the modern-day state of Illinois, villages and monuments were constructed at the Eveland site, and in Wisconsin, the Aztlan and Trempealeau sites were built. Alongside rivers of the Midwest and Southeast, Cahokia-style communities sprang up at the archaeological sites of Angel, Kincaid, Shiloh, Moundville, and Okmulgee. Each of these cities had around 1 to 200 flat-top mounds atop which stood wooden buildings that are believed to have served as temples. Single rulers or councils of rulers governed and collected tribute from the peoples in these communities. The success of the corn crop and success on the battlefield with neighboring communities could make or break these cities. By around 1100 AD, the American Midwest, Southeast, and the Mississippian South had become Cahokianized. The biggest consequence of this spread of Cahokian influence was the widespread adoption of maize or corn. At around 1050 AD, when Cahokia was undergoing its massive building projects, people living within the area in and around Cahokia ventured up the Mississippi River around 500 miles to start isolated communities in the areas of what today are the modern cities of Stoddard and Trempealeau in Wisconsin. As the trip went against the currents of the flow of the river, the journey would have taken around 30 days. The trip was potentially treacherous as well, as it would have ventured into territory settled by other tribes, and they would have had to contend with rapids. A settlement was built in Stoddard, while at Trempealeau a shrine was built. Hundreds of items that had been made in Cahokia have been found at the Stoddard site. Wall trench buildings, a style of architecture originating in Cahokia, have been found at the site as well. So far, no evidence has thus far arisen to show that there was any conflict between the Cahokian colonists and the neighboring tribes surrounding them, as no defensive structures and only a few arrowheads have been found. Despite this, the settlement only existed for around 20 years between 1050 to 1070 AD. Going 30 more miles up the Mississippi River, the Cahokian colonists would have seen tall bluffs staring down at them from each side of the river. Among these bluffs there is Trempealeau Mountain. It is atop this mountain that the Cahokian colonists constructed an outpost consisting of several mounds. Each of the mounds were constructed in the exact same way as the mounds at Cahokia, in the sense that each layer of the mounds consisted of a thick yellow layer that was then topped with a black-colored layer. Around the bottom of the bluff, there have been found many dwellings constructed using the Cahokian wall trench style. Many artifacts made from materials that came from Cahokia have also been found there. Likewise, the Trempealeau settlement also lasted for only 10 to 20 years, between 1050 to 1070 AD. For the next several decades, no Cahokians lived in the area. Within the archaeological remains of the various Cahokianized settlements are found small artifacts that were made originally at Cahokia itself, which indicates that merchants, missionaries, or emissaries from Cahokia brought the objects to the sites. These artifacts often took the form of red stone statuettes that were carved into various forms, such as goddesses, ancestors, spirit animals, shamans, and culture heroes. One of the most prominent archaeological features, indicating immense Cahokian influence upon the entire region, were the omnipresent dwellings built using wall trenches. This style of architecture began in Cahokia, before rapidly spreading across the Midwest and the South. Builders would dig a four-sided trench in the ground, and then they would build sections of wall separately before placing them within the trenches. In the middle of the 11th century AD, roughly concurrent to the time when Cahokia was founded and began expanding its influence, almost overnight people of the central Illinois River Valley region began imitating Cahokian lifestyle. By the beginning of the 12th century AD, the inhabitants of this region began constructing Cahokian-style temples and engaging in ritual human sacrifice. However, this phase of imitating Cahokia's culture only lasted for about 50 years, before the region cut off trade ties with Cahokia and abandoned many of their Cahokian-style towns and ritual centers, oftentimes burning them to the ground in ritualistic ways. Warfare between the various communities that had once been converted to Cahokian ways now broke out on a substantial scale. In reaction to this, many communities established new settlements on the edges of cliffs. This would have given the community a wide field of view from which to spot oncoming attackers and a good defensible position. Likewise, the villagers built their houses closely packed together with a wooden wall encircling it all. By 1200 AD, most of the population of the Illinois River Valley region had moved into fortified cliff-top villages. These new types of communities transformed the lifestyle of their inhabitants. Whereas before they were used to roaming the lands for hunting or agricultural purposes, due to the fear of enemy attack, many were now too afraid to stray too far from their defenses. As a result of this restricted movement, the health of the women in the region began to decline. Furthermore, the foods now consumed were less nutritious, as these communities had to primarily rely on a patch of maize near their fort, as opposed to the more varied diet they once had from hunting and gathering. By the late 1200s AD, many of these cliff-top villages were burned to the ground with all the valuables of the villagers in it. Archaeologists believe that these events were almost certainly caused by warfare. In around 1450 AD, a massive drought hit the entire Illinois River Valley region. This led to the mass abandonment of wide swaths of the region. The people that fled the region would eventually coalesce and become members of the historic Native American tribes of the Omaha, Osage, and Iowa. By 1150 AD, Cahokia had expanded its size and power even further to become the most powerful chiefdom in the entire region. Some archaeologists argue that at this point, Cahokia's political classification status had arisen to that of a state. Cahokia most likely had social stratification in their society, as many skeletal remains of individuals found at the site indicate a diet largely consisting of corn, which indicates a low status, whereas other skeletal remains indicate a protein-based diet revolving around fish and deer, which indicates higher status. The site of Cahokia would eventually grow to contain over 120 mounds and encompass about 5 square miles, which made it the largest mound complex in North America. Many archaeologists believe that the layout of the platform mounds in Cahokia are aligned to the movements of the moon. Further adding weight to this theory is the fact that many other tribes in the same region of eastern North America have been known since the days of first contact with Europeans to hold important ceremonies based upon important dates that align with the movements of the moon. The most spectacular of the mounds at Cahokia is Monks Mound, which is a rectangular platform about 100 feet high and spanning over 16 acres of ground at its base. With regards to its volume, it is estimated to contain 731,000 cubic meters of soil. The structure is estimated to have taken 3 million hours of labor to build. Monks Mound was constructed between 1050 and 1150 AD in several different construction periods. On the right side frontal portion of the second tier of the mound, there arises a small mound that is, according to archaeologists, a marker indicating the very center of the precinct. Behind this protrusion was a pole and thatch building that most likely was a temple or shrine. Near the temple there once arose a tall wooden post that contained lots of copper fragments. Archaeologists have theorized the post with a lightning rod, and indeed when a lightning rod was placed in the same location by archaeologists, lightning hit the rod constantly. In the midst of these structures, there also was a 40-acre completely flat plaza. Enclosing it all was a wooden fence. Monks Mound and several other mounds in downtown Cahokia were likewise once surrounded by a 200-acre spanning wooden wall. Around 400 meters east of Monks Mound, there once arose a mound which has come to be referred to as Mound 34 by archaeologists. Excavations in the vicinity of this mound have revealed the remnants of a copper workshop. So far, it has been the only copper workshop found at a site associated with Mississippian civilization. Using this copper, artists produced many different kinds of religious artifacts, such as long-nosed god maskettes and ceremonial earrings. 850 meters to the west of Monks Mound, there once stood several wood monuments, consisting of poles of timber planted into the ground, encircling one lone pole in the middle. These monuments are referred to as Woodhenges, after Stonehenge in England. They are estimated to have been made between the years 900 and 1100 AD. Each subsequent construction throughout the ages was made larger than the one that came before it. The holes for each wooden post were typically 7 feet deep and 2 feet in width. Each timber pole was around 20 feet tall. It has been theorized that the constructions were massive calendars used to keep track of solstices and equinoxes. Some archaeoastronomers have speculated further that these constructions also may have been used to watch other events in the heavens, such as the movements of the moon and the planets of the solar system. At the base of Monks Mound was a vast artificially flattened plain, referred to by archaeologists as the Grand Plaza. The Grand Plaza covered about 50 acres, and its dimensions are approximated to around 1,600 feet in length and over 900 feet in width. Analysis of the soil where the Grand Plaza once covered a vast area has indicated that the area's natural state before human alteration was once an undulating ridge. The flattening of these ridges involved mathematics and was sophisticated in execution. Vast numbers of Cahokians could have stood on its surface during ceremonies and rituals. Going south of the area encompassing Monks Mound and the Grand Plaza, there once was an enormous pathway that arose between 0.5 to 1.3 meters off of the swampy, marshy ground. Spanning about 18 meters wide and around 800 meters in length, the pathway is referred to as Rattlesnake Causeway. The pathway is aligned approximately 5 degrees east of north. This orientation is theorized to have had religious and spiritual significance for Cahokians. Going south about halfway down the length of the Rattlesnake Causeway, off the side of the pathway, there once stood a mortuary mound known as Mound 72. Excavations of the mound have revealed the burial of a 40-year-old man who was most likely a very prominent member of Cahokian society. The man had been placed atop a bed of around 20,000 seashells, positioned in the shape of a falcon. The head of the bird shone from beneath the man's head, while the bird's wings and tail shone from beneath the man's arms and legs. Throughout Mississippian society, the falcon warrior or birdman was a common cultural theme. Near the grave of the man, there was also found a large amount of well-made and complex arrowheads, knapped into a wide variety of shapes. The arrowheads consisted of 4 different types. Each of the types originated from a different geographical region. This suggests that Cahokia maintained an extensive trade network with the peoples of its region. Buried near this man were the skeletal remains of 250 individuals, most of whom are believed to have been victims of human sacrifice. Around 120 of the individuals were women ranging in age from 15 to 25 years old, all of whom bore evidence of malnutrition during their lifetimes. Another group of around 40 men and women appeared to have been killed in a violent way. Some of these potential victims may even have been buried alive due to the vertical orientation of their fingers, which suggests that they died trying to dig their way out once they had been buried. 4 young males were also found with missing hands and skulls. A little ways past the end of Rattlesnake Causeway, there arose a ridge, atop which stood a mound structure named Rattlesnake Mound. This mound served as a tomb. A game called Chunky was played on the Grand Plaza. Archaeological evidence for the game goes all the way back to 600 AD and has been unearthed near the Mississippi River in western Illinois and the eastern region of Missouri. Researchers think the game has its origins as a children's game played while at home and possibly dates back to hundreds of years before the rise of Cahokia. These early chunky stones were small, being only 1 or 2 inches in diameter, and were poorly made. However, by 900 AD, chunky stones show up more in the archaeological record, and are larger in diameter and better made. By 1050 AD, the game of Chunky became a large-scale spectator event within the city of Cahokia. The game was then rapidly exported to other communities up and down the Mississippi River by Cahokian travelers. The Cahokian-style chunky discs were expertly and carefully sculpted. At this time and place, they appear to have attained a standardized dimension with distinctive concave sides. 2 players holding wooden poles would stand beside each other, facing a wooden post planted into the ground in the distance. Another player would throw a disc-shaped stone about 2 to 5 inches in diameter towards the wooden post, making it roll on its side. At the very moment the chunky stone left the player's hand, the other 2 players holding the wooden poles would then run after the disc. The object of the game was to throw one's wooden pole at the chunky stone, either while it was moving or when it became stationary. The player whose wooden pole was closest to the chunky stone once it became stationary was the winner of the round. Chunky matches were arduous affairs, as they often lasted the entire day. Next to the Grand Plaza there is a large pit that was dug up around the time of the construction of Monks Mound and the Grand Plaza during the 1050s AD. The pit was soon used as a trash heap, as it became filled with waste from ceremonies. Items such as food, shattered pots, and chips of wood and ash have been found there. Pits like these dot the landscape, and subsequently provided ample amounts of clay for all the many earthen constructions of Cahokia. The region was well suited for such earthen creations, as it was swampy and had lots of heavy, black, and water-colored clays. Spilling out for hundreds of acres outside the 200-acre enclosure surrounding the mound complex are many residential structures. By the late 11th century AD, many farmers in the vicinity and farmers from far away had moved to the central Cahokia precinct. A population that had once been around 2,000 before the massive building projects now jumped to around 10,000. Archaeologists have identified 3 different precincts of Cahokia: a St. Louis, East St. Louis, and a central Cahokia precinct. Thousands more lived in the precincts of St. Louis and East St. Louis. Between 1050 and 1150 AD, if the surrounding countrysides are to be included in the population count, Cahokia would have been around 30,000 to 40,000 people. In terms of its population and land area, Cahokia at its height in the 12th century AD was larger than St. Louis was before 1840, larger than London was in 1050 AD, and about equal to the early cities of Mesopotamia and Mexico. In comparison to all other communities in North America, Cahokia by and large was the biggest. In the rural areas of Cahokia, farmers lived in small villages consisting of a few dwellings surrounded by their crops. Cahokian religious temples and possibly homes for elites or priests were scattered among these villages. Among these villages were a few towns that had populations of around a couple hundred people. Each of these towns had platform mounds, a central plaza, and ceremonial buildings. In a prairie 14 miles to the east of Cahokia, there once lay a cluster of civic and ceremonial structures that is now referred to as the Emerald Site. It is unlikely that anyone lived in the area, as they were most likely used as shrines rather than houses. These cluster of shrines may have been constructed to worship the powers of the earth and the sky, but most especially the moon, as they are aligned with the northernmost point at which the moon rises on the eastern horizon. This astronomical event rarely occurred, which may have increased its significance with Cahokians. Powerful Cahokians and prominent Cahokianized people of the Midwest, South, and Southeastern North America were buried with many artifacts and treasures. Many of these items are categorized by archaeologists as belonging to the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. According to archaeologists, the term simply is just used to categorize similar-looking objects that have been found all throughout Eastern North America, and which belong to a loose set of beliefs that were likely widely held by many in the region. Many chiefs were buried with finely crafted artifacts, made of raw materials that were not available locally. This indicates that chiefs were almost certainly the primary members of the society that communicated with outside communities. Archaeologists think the artifacts that the chiefs possessed were used as gifts to be given to other communities, to seal alliances, or to pay tribute. Throughout the 12th century AD, Cahokian artists carved countless red stone figurines out of a stone called flint clay. These carvings have been found all over the North American Southeast. The material used to make these sculptures came from a single source in the present-day state of Missouri, west of St. Louis. Figurines of females were almost exclusively bunched together at Cahokia and its suburbs and rural areas. One sculpture found depicts a woman working the fields upon the back of a serpent. Another sculpture found shows a woman on her knees with a basket while clutching a stalk of corn. Cahokian priests were somewhat similar to Siberian shamans due to the way they are depicted in the red stone figurines. The figurines show them going through soul journeys, engaging with spirits, and changing shape while in an altered state of mind, due to the facial expressions that show the priest with a trance-like expression. By the beginning of the 12th century AD, many settlements of southeastern North America were adopting Cahokian ways. By the 1200s AD, Moundville, located in the western central region of what is today Alabama, had grown to become one of the largest of these communities. At around 1300 AD, Moundville was abandoned, but the site continued to be used as a burial ground. However, by 1450 AD, the site was completely abandoned and was no longer used for any purpose. In northwestern present-day Georgia, at around 1300 AD, another important settlement named Etowah, with strong Cahokian influences, came on the scene. In approximately 1375 AD, at the height of its power, Etowah was burned to the ground, and its sacred mortuary temple was vandalized. The settlement was subsequently abandoned. At around 1500 AD, people began moving into the area again, but Etowah never regained its former glory. Sometime in the 1160s or 1170s AD, most of Cahokia's wooden structures burned and were destroyed. After this incident, only religious shrines were reconstructed on top of platform mounds at the East St. Louis precinct. These, however, remained standing for only about another century. It is still not clear if Cahokia was destroyed due to an attack by outsiders. Complicating the picture is the fact that ritual burning was a common act among peoples of the Mississippi, and therefore the fires that burned down Cahokia may have been part of a ritual. Whatever the exact reason of the fires, they mark the beginning of the end of Cahokia. Some archaeologists have suggested that by 1200 AD, severe drought crippled Cahokia's food source, leading to weakness. It has been further suggested that this led to other Mississippian groups to the south eventually gaining control of Cahokia. Throughout the 1200s AD, most Mississippian communities became fortified. Archaeologists think that this indicates that there was warfare between the different communities, as many of these communities bear evidence of being burned to the ground. Coinciding with this evidence of potential warfare was the calamity of climate change, as the medieval warm period drew to a close, leading to colder temperatures and less rain, and therefore less food. All that is known for sure is that by 1350 AD, all the people residing in Cahokia had ceased to live in the area. Archaeologists also believe that flooding may have contributed to the downfall of Cahokia, as 2 catastrophic floods are said to have occurred throughout the city's history. The first flood, which occurred between 1100 and 1260 AD, almost certainly was crippling to Cahokia, but still, the city continued to exist. However, a second flood which struck Cahokia between 1340 and 1460 AD may have been a major factor in the demise of Cahokia, as the date range coincides with the date when Cahokia was completely abandoned. During the 13th and 14th centuries AD, descendants of the Cahokians slowly migrated out of the area. Some of these people migrated south, following the Mississippi River to live with other Mississippians. Others migrated west into the Great Plains region. By around 1400 AD, the majority of communities in the central Mississippi River Valley region had become uninhabited as well. In the north and northwestern regions of the Mississippi River, as well as the deep south, warfare became rampant among the Cahokian-style communities dotting the landscape that still remained active. These war-torn communities in southeastern North America would make contact for the first time with Europeans when the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto and his expedition made contact with the peoples of the region in 1540 AD. Hernando de Soto adopted a highly belligerent stance against the people of the region and spent the next 3 years fighting tribe after tribe, all the while traveling the region in search of gold and other riches, as well as locations that could be suitable for colonization. After 3 years of fighting and sustaining heavy casualties, Hernando de Soto eventually died from a fever on May 21st, 1542, and his men subsequently retreated back towards Mexico City in defeat, having found neither gold nor founded any colonies. Though the indigenous people of southeastern North America had successfully driven off the Europeans, Old world diseases which had been introduced to the region by Hernando de Soto and his expedition would in the next few decades decimate the populations of the region, leading to the collapse of their societies. By the time Europeans again made contact with the peoples of the region, completely new cultures and political structures had arose from the ashes of the Mississippian civilizations. Though they didn't know it at the time, De Soto and his men were the first and last Europeans to witness Mississippian civilization. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.